So I'm Sean Slade. I am Senior Director of, or the official title is Senior Director of Global Outreach at WSCC. However, what I'm best known for is anything which is related to our whole child mission, the WSCC model, the whole school, whole community, whole child model, and really the alignment of health and education in the school and community setting. What I'm going to do now is share my screen, and I will, let's make sure, yep, that works. And we can jump into the presentation. Let me just make sure I have my chat up there as well. Continue for 1 minute. There we go. Perfect. Okay. I believe also that you have the PDFs of these slides as well. And what I also make sure that everybody knows at the very start is if I give out my contact details, which you have here in front of you, then if you ask me a question, if you send me an email, I will respond. So if I'm giving you contact, if I'm asking you to send in questions, then please feel free if you have any question about anything that I'm discussing or anything which may not be clear during my talk, then please feel free to contact me. What I've also done as well there is given you 3 websites that you may want to refer back to. The first one talks about our whole child work. The second one talks about the WSCC model, which Stephanie was just outlining. And the third one talks about a new initiative, a free initiative, just like the previous 2, which is our whole child network. And I'll be discussing that during today's session as well. So what I'd like to do today, given this is the first talk for this Healthy Schools Academy, is I really want to focus or refocus on the need for us to emphasize health, well-being, and education in our schools. I want to then talk about the WSCC model, because we believe that even though this was developed 5 years ago, it's actually a very good framework and model for the current times and current crisis that we're in, to ensure that we are getting the right people at the table. Thirdly, what I'd like to do is to just make sure that we're aware, not that we're not aware of COVID, but really how COVID is changing the playing field. And then the last section is to really focus on the tools that we have available that we're recommending for schools and districts, not only across Louisiana, but across the country to use during this time. And then, as mentioned, we're hoping to have, or we're planning to have, at least 10, 15 minutes at the end for some Q&A. So what I'm going to do now is start with an activity. And I'm doing this so we can start to reframe what we are talking about and reframe where I'm coming from in this conversation. And you see some words up there appearing on your screen: below grade level reading ability, hunger, asthma, bullying, vision, below grade level math ability, violence, connectedness, poor disciplinary record, health, homelessness, disengagement, relationships. You know, to be honest, the list could go on. So I'm picking a dozen or so words there to put on your screen for you to think about. And the question is, which of these influences the child's ability to learn? And if you are able to put your answers into the chat box, which I am having some difficulty showing up, but I'll let you put your answers into the chat box. I can already somewhat suspect what the answers are going to be for this, but I'll give you a minute or two. If you're in a school or if you're with colleagues in a venue, then please feel free to discuss this as well. I've done this when we do this in person or we do this in other venues. We often put these responses up as poll everywhere. This was the last time we did it, where people were able to text in their responses. Homelessness, engagement, hunger, the bigger the word, the more it's been texted in. Environment, bullying, poverty. And yes, it is a trick question. All of the above, relationships, teacher, could add sleep in there, compassion, home life. All of these things impact the child's ability to learn. What I imagine was entered into the chat box was similar responses, probably all of the above and more. Or there are certain things that you are aware that impact the child's ability to learn. These are the issue that I have with this list though. There are certain things which we as educators and we as teachers are meant to pay attention to. We're encouraged to pay attention to below grade level reading ability. We're encouraged to pay attention to below grade level math ability and poor disciplinary record. Sometimes we're encouraged or not discouraged in focusing on things to do with bullying or disengagement in learning or relationships. However, more often than not, educators are discouraged or at least not encouraged to focus on things to do with hunger or asthma or vision or violence or even connectedness or even health. We're often encouraged to allow that to be the purview or the responsibility of somebody else. But I'm here to ask you at the same time, are any of these things socially acceptable to ignore? Now, I'm not saying that schools or teachers especially should be solving these problems. However, what I am saying is that schools and teachers, if they know that violence or hunger or health or vision is going to impact the child's ability to learn, then teachers and schools have a responsibility to adjust what is occurring in the school and adjust what is occurring in the classroom to try and buffer or ameliorate those issues. And it may be as simple as putting them in touch with health experts or health services. But if we know that these things impact the child's ability to learn and we dismiss them as not our responsibility, we are abdicating our responsibility. We talked about the WSCC model, at least in the introduction, and I imagine most of you have seen this model. ASCD co-developed this with the CDC back in 2014, and it's become, over the last 5 years, the preeminent school health or coordinated school health model across the US. And as I was mentioning earlier on, during this time of COVID, it's actually become a model which has been very useful to focus attention on areas that need attention over the last 7 months or 8 months. We actually ran a series of webinars with CDC starting in March when schools began closing down. The initial focus of those webinars were things obviously around physical health or physical environment, but also the social emotional climate. There was a strong concern about making sure that schools were closing or they were being cleaned, or there was testing going on. But from an educational perspective, there was a focus around making sure that those students especially felt connected and they felt part of that school environment or that learning environment. As we began to do another series of webinars the next month, the conversation continued or expanded into employee wellness, not just teachers, but any adult who is employed in the school setting. Family engagement, community involvement. We began to see more interaction between the community and back with the school at the same time. As the shutdown went into summer and into the school vacation, we began to understand that there needs to be more focus around counseling, psychological, social services, health services, nutrition services. How are we making sure that students who need food are getting food? How are we making sure that students who need health services are getting health services? And as we began to open up for this school year, we've seen increased attention on things to do with physical education, physical activity, health education, almost as a way to ameliorate some of the effects of the crises that we're going through, and also to prepare us for what might come next. Really, it's a long way of saying that we're focusing attention on the child. We're focusing attention on those tenets, the healthy, safe, engaged, supported, challenged. And really, we're focusing on everything that's part and parcel of this whole school, whole community, whole child model. When we released this in 2014, we were declaring that really it was time for health and education to come together. When we first released our whole child work back in 2007, we made a point of stating that it was time for us to put the child in the center of the equation and then to array whatever resources need be around that child. And so when we designed the model, it was designed so that we could start to talk primarily to the education community on the need for educators and community to focus on the health and well-being of their students, but also of the adults who make up that community. It's time for us to put these two sectors together and work more in harmony. You know, many of you may have seen this phrase as well, but I do think that this has really been in the last 8 months our national or / global Maslow before Bloom event. Now, what we mean by that phrase, just to clarify, is that it's really Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which are things that we all need not only to survive, but to thrive. Our physiological needs, our needs for safety or love and belonging, through to self-actualization. These things need to be established before we start to worry about, move this out the way so you can see, before we need to worry about learning and development and cognitive ability. Because we know that if the child is not healthy, if the child is not safe, if the environment is not healthy, it's very difficult for that child to learn, to develop, to collaborate, to synthesize. However, for the longest time, we've almost again ignored some of these things about the physiological needs or the safety needs, and we've jumped straight into things to do with remembering or applying or analyzing. And then we start to ask ourselves, why aren't our students learning? Why aren't they developing? It may be as simple as that they don't feel safe in the environment. It may be as simple as that they don't feel like they belong. And for those people who are familiar with our whole child work or that WSCC model as well, when we developed it back in 2007, we actually developed those tenets of the healthy, safe, engaged, supported, challenged, directly corresponding to Maslow's hierarchy. And there's a reason, obviously, why you have healthy on the bottom, followed by safe, and then engaged and supported and challenged. And these are the same tenets that you see in the middle of that WSCC model. That we believe at ASCD as an education association are fundamental for successful schools and a successful education. When we developed the WSCC model as well, a lot of the work came out of the work of Charles Bash from Columbia University. He put out a wonderful synopsis of research back in 2010 called Healthier Students Are Better Learners, which when you read it is not shocking, but what's shocking is the fact that we haven't actually applied many of his findings. But it's obvious that education progress, as he states, will be limited if students are not only motivated, but if they're not able to learn. If they can't see the whiteboard, if they can't attend the school, if they don't feel safe, if they don't feel connected. He actually developed or cited 7 health disparities, many of which were in that little activity we did at the very start around asthma and violence and hunger and vision. But if we just focused attention on those 7 health disparities, we would see educational gain by changing nothing about education. This quote was from NPR in 2016, showing that 1 in 5 kids living in the US were showing signs or symptoms of mental health disorders in any given year. But also almost or more worrying than that is that most children, nearly 80% who need mental health services, won't get them. As we start to read through some of the numbers that I'll be citing in these next few slides, remember the dates of these. 2016, pre-COVID. YRBS, this is also, I know that Melissa was talking about some of the YRBS results for Louisiana at the very start from 2019. These are the latest YRBS national reports around mental health. So seriously considered attempting suicide has increased from 2007 to 2019. Making a suicide plan has increased in the last 10 years. Attempted has increased. Now, what we need to remember as well is some of these numbers, at least the seriously considered attempting suicide has certainly gone down since 1991, but it's starting to pick up again. But what we need to also understand, again, is that this is 2019. And I think we will all appreciate that the level of stress and the lack of supports is being heightened during this time. Now, what that means is we need to do more to ensure that our students and our communities are safe, supportive environments. Because the truth is that COVID has changed the playing field. We're in a different environment. We are in a different world. And to be honest, I think it's very unlikely that we are ever going to return to the way that schooling used to be, or even the way that our sectors interact with each other. As with any major change, there are positives and there are negatives. The negatives are there for everybody to see. But just like Melissa was saying as well in her introduction, there are some positives. Melissa was talking early on about, giving you all a big thank you for the amount of effort and work that you've done during this time. And there has been this appreciation of expertise that maybe we didn't have for all of the people that we need to help us in our communities, in society. There has been a reappreciation of health service workers. There's been a reappreciation of education support professionals. There's been a reappreciation of frontline workers. There's been a reappreciation of people who are stocking the shelves and going to work in the supermarkets every day during the pandemic. There has been a reappreciation of educators. And I think what this has done is it's opened the doors for people to see that the roles that all of you have are not nice to haves, they are critical, they are crucial for a harmonious functioning community. Now, other things that have happened as a result of schools reopening in whatever form they are reopening is there's been this sigh of relief, is getting back to something nearing or something moving towards normality. There has been a reappreciation of our community. There's been a reappreciation of expertise. And fundamentally, I think there's been a reappreciation of the role of well-being across our communities. However, at the same time, it would be foolish or Pollyanna-ish of us to have a look at what's happened in COVID and not understand that we've had increasing levels of anxiety, increasing levels and fear around vulnerability, and we've had deep and widespread trauma affecting not just one portion of society, but all portions of society. Yes, to differing levels, but there's nobody that hasn't been affected by COVID, and there's nobody that hasn't been affected in some way by the trauma that COVID is causing. But just to reiterate some of the positives again, and this comes from an article that was in ASCD, our blog, a couple of months ago, talking about well-being. There has been this reappreciation of us to focus not only on the individual, but also our communal well-being, that we're part of this together. We saw very early on, we saw the opera singing in Italy. We saw the applause of the health service workers in New York. We've seen the parades that teachers have put on, or that parents have put on for teachers when schools were closed early on. And what's also been really encouraging is, as schools have reopened and districts have reopened, the majority of districts and schools have reopened, and the first thing they did was try to ensure that students felt connected, they felt safe, they felt part of the school system. Even like with my own kids, that's completely online and remote. There's an understanding that people need to feel part of something, they need a support network. Now, what's also been encouraging is to see how this has been playing out throughout the country. You've seen op-eds, you've seen articles, you've seen a reframing of some of the policies and some of the directions from departments of education, departments of health, to really refocus on the child and refocus on health and well-being. It's almost allowed us to do this reset of what we're trying to achieve with our students and what we're trying to achieve via our schools. Growth mindset during the pandemic, caring for students' well-being in a coronavirus world. The COVID pandemic shows that child success depends more than what happens only in schools. There's been a reappraisal. It's allowed us to rethink what we're doing and how we're doing it. And for anybody who is involved in the health services, this is an opportunity for health services and health professionals to be re-engaged in the educational process. Just this week, Ohio released their whole child framework. And as you can see, it's basically the WSCC model with some Ohio-sized coloring added to it. But it's really the same model that we were showing you before. Again, harking back to those tenets around whole child. And then some of the things that they're recommending that schools do in terms of the ASCD whole child framework and then the school improvement tool are 3 things that I'm going to be talking to you about and recommending that you start to use with your schools and communities moving forward. We have seen over the last couple of months, probably 5 or 6 states who have begun to launch their whole child work using the WSCC model. And Louisiana is definitely one of those. We're also giving a talk next week in Missouri as well. But you've also seen not only Ohio, you've seen Michigan, you've seen Wisconsin, you've seen Georgia, you've seen Illinois, you've seen Kentucky. Starting to make these changes, putting the child back at the center and reframing how we do support that child with services. But as we mentioned in terms of trauma, what's different about COVID is that this is not one incident that's affected one portion of society. It's not, as with, say, a tornado coming through a town or a violent incident, something which is affecting one group or one portion or one geography. It's affecting everybody. There's nobody that hasn't been affected. But at the same time, it's also shown that these cracks in our society are more often being exposed as chasms in our society because it's those who are most marginalized, who have the fewest supports, who are also suffering the most. It's also those people that we talked about earlier on and we were thanking earlier on, and it's including many of you in this audience, the frontline workers, the school health professionals, you have been suffering at the same time. And so whilst it's the automatic assumption or reaction of adults such as yourselves to start to care about children and care about somebody else, let's not forget that you also need support and you also need care, that you are also going through varying degrees of trauma. And just like educators, health professionals are also ones who very often discourage support. They try and give it off to somebody else. And sometimes we are the hardest people to actually receive support and help. Now, there are some things that we can do in the short term. And one of the nice things about working at ASCD is when you're with an organization that's been doing research and articles around education for the last 77 years, there are things you can refer back to. Now, granted, nothing has affected us as much as COVID, but even last year in October, we had an article of our EL magazine highlighting how we can make schools a safer place. And there are things that we know from research on a day-to-day basis about checking in with people. This could be students or it also could be staff, about patterns and schedules and how they provide structure, about how relationships help build up protective factors, being open to discuss why things are happening, not just related to COVID, but anything. And also looking at ideas around self-regulation, managing feelings, alone time, mindfulness, getting outside. And the last one is going to the well. And what we mean by going to the well is really building up the relationships that have been formed and developed over these last 7-8 months. And maybe they've always been there, and maybe they've been strengthened, or maybe these are relationships that have been restarted again because of this. The closest thing we've ever had to the COVID was really the bird flu outbreak in 2009. And while that was severe in certain areas, it didn't have the widespread effect that COVID is having. So we want you to grow and nurture and embed the relationships that have been developed. Now, on an individual basis, with families, with communities, with parents, but we also want you to grow and develop the connections between services and agencies, especially between education and health and public health and school health services and nutrition services and transportation. And really start to use the framework of the WSCC model to understand who should be or who isn't at the table during these discussions. So use this time to grow and nurture these connections, and use this time to really embed health and well-being back into the process. When we developed the WSCC model, obviously we weren't planning for COVID to occur, but we also understood from a fundamental level that health and well-being were critical, they were key. So let's use this time to put the child at the center, as we were saying before, and array those services around that child. All right, so let me jump in now to talk about what I recommend you start to think about and some of the tools that are available to you. Everything I'm showing you here is free. All right, you don't have to be an ASCD member. We'd love you to be. You don't have to be. You don't have to sign up or buy anything. Or you don't need to buy anything. All we do ask you to do is to sign up and to be a part of our whole child network. And I believe, let me just move my little, yeah, there we have it. If anybody is curious, that's the URL down the bottom of this free network. So here's what we have available. We have a free whole child school improvement tool. Now, ASCD, remember, is an education association. So we speak to educators. Our 115,000 members are principals, experienced teachers, superintendents. So we speak educational talk and educational language. We developed this free school improvement tool so that schools can start to embed a whole child approach back into what they do fundamentally as part and parcel of their school improvement process. What we didn't want to have is educational improvement over here and health and well-being over here. We want these things aligned. Because when you talk about health and well-being, you're actually developing the environments that are most conducive to effective teaching and learning. When you go onto this survey, and the survey takes about 20 minutes, it's free. You can set it up as a district. You can set it up as a school. You can then have an automatic email that you send out to anybody that you want to complete the survey. And what you do is you go through and you're doing a needs assessment perception of healthy, safe, engaged, supported, challenged. Again, it's those tenets at the center of the WSCC model. And then they are delineated by 10 indicators. It's anonymous. If you are the manager of the account setting it up, you can track how many people have completed it. You can expand or reduce the amount of time they have to do it. You won't know exactly who has done it because it's anonymous, but you will know how many people have completed it. What you get automatically is you get a result in accordance with those tenets: the healthy, safe, engaged, supported, challenged. This comes to you as a PDF that you can then send out to anybody. You also get a readout of how your school or how your district is doing with regard to the WSCC model. So again, you're getting scores along that Likert scale. And what this starts to show you is areas that you may need more attention, where you're scoring the lowest, where it's being highlighted in red. But here's where it gets interesting, at least I think so. Ever since November of last year, which feels like 5 years ago, you also receive a detailed report which highlights the areas of strength and the areas of weakness or need across all of those indicators. Now, the reason we give you areas of strength is as you start to do school improvement, you don't always need to focus on your weaknesses. Especially during this time of COVID, maybe you want to make sure that the things that your school and community are doing well become sustainable parts of the culture and the fabric of that school. Maybe you decide that we have enough to deal with, and let's pat our teachers and pat our community workers on the back and support them. And that's quite justifiable. You may, though, want to focus on some areas of need. And maybe there's one that comes out of this story. So the reason that we provide this is it's almost like a flashlight on things that you're doing well and things that you may need support with. What you also get here is you get these indicators linked to ASCD resources, which are specifically aligned to each of those indicators. So you have a next step or you have a next reading. Being completely open, everything I'm showing you is free. The resources either come if you're a member or either come if you're subscribed. Everything else is free. The reports are free. You can also get, if you wanted to, all of your 50 indicators in Excel file to have a look through them. We've also developed a guide to help you move through understanding how to get the results, what those results mean, and what to do with them. Now, based on a continuous school improvement logic model, this guide walks you through how to understand those results and then what to do with them. How to start designing what you're going to do this year, how to bring a team together, who should be on that team. And then what are you going to actually do and how are you going to gauge whether or not it's been successful. So this free whole child network guide walks you through the process of continuous school improvement. We also add in there as well, if you're using the WSCC model, ways that you can actually use those scores from the WSCC report to understand better exactly what your school and community are doing. So what we're trying to do is to make it as easy as possible for all of these things that you're doing around the WSCC model to flow back into a continuous school improvement process. Whilst it's great that we've had health services focusing or part of the discussions during the reopening, what we want is we want health services, community service to be part and parcel with continuous school improvement processes from here on, moving forward. Now, I'll show you this. If this looks a bit too overwhelming, please feel free to dismiss it or ignore it. But we've had over 60,000 uses of this school improvement tool since 2012, and we have a number of schools and districts that have been using it, and they want to understand, how do we know if we're improving? How do we know if we're growing? What should we move to next? So what we've also developed, again, stemming out of those tenets of healthy, safe, engaged, supported, challenged, is we've developed a continuum of benchmarks that span across 3 levels. So it spans across schools which are starting. What benchmark would indicator 1 look like? Schools that are progressing and schools that are excelling. And these go down along all of those 10 indicators for healthy, 10 indicators for safe, engaged, supported, and challenged. And the idea here is so you can start to plot a path to see, you know what, we're doing really well in terms of supported. We're almost like a level 2 or a level 3 in many of these indicators. But we're still maybe a level 1 for a couple of these around healthy or safe. And so you can start to see where you're excelling and where you might need more support. Again, if this is too much information, please feel free to, temporarily let this one slide, but be aware that there's a lot of information and resources that we have, again, to allow health and well-being to become part and parcel of what a school does moving forward. Additionally, and again, all of the things that you see here are free. There are additional resources that come either via our ASCD state affiliates. There are videos on how-tos. There is support which is available, and I'm going to give you the contact details of our regional partner, Todd Jones, at the end of this session as well. So if you are looking for additional support and help, we certainly provide that. And then there are a couple of publications we put out which outline our whole child work and what we're trying to achieve. This was from 2 weeks ago. We launched the Whole Child Network in end of 2019. And as of 2 weeks ago, we have over 1,600 members. We have over 300 school districts. Every state and territory is recognized as part of the Whole Child Network. We have probably now we're over 500 additional schools. And that doesn't include all of the schools that are part of these districts that have signed up, but some schools have signed up individually. We have 22 state affiliates that have signed up. We have 23 universities, typically they are schools of education, that have signed up. And even though this is predominantly a US based membership, we now have members who are spanning 54 countries. Given the work, or given the announcement last week from Ohio, we currently have around 100 members in Ohio. We'll expect that to grow exponentially moving forward. Given the focus of the work in Louisiana, I believe we have about 40 members in Louisiana. We would hope that in Louisiana, this also starts to grow exponentially. The next stage of this work will be actually making this network become more of a network, so that schools and experts in Louisiana can share their expertise with schools in Ohio or in Michigan or in California or in Arkansas. So the idea is to make this a network where it's not only one-way information from ASCD, but there's two-way information going back and forth across members and across the network. And then just to sum up as well, and then we're going to open it up for some questions if I can get that chat box working. What I want you to realize is, I think we're going to look back at this time in 5 or 10 years and finally appreciate this was a watershed in the way that our sectors and our services work together. So we are at a bridge, or we are at a break in the river. This is the opportunity for many of us to stand up and insist to be at the table as schools are reopening or closing or reopening again or reworking their policies. This is a time for health to be at the education table, because what gets planned out during this school year, and I do believe this will be an ongoing W-shaped discussion, what gets discussed during this school year will be the way that our schools and our communities function for the next 5, 10 years moving forward. So this is the opportunity to be heard, and be heard because you're putting the needs of the child and the community at the center. So thank you very much for your time. I hope that I've at least set the scene from the way that ASCD and our whole child work is envisaging and looking at this COVID-19 situation. I thank you again for all the efforts that you've put in over the last 8 months to take care of your communities. I urge you to take care of yourself as well, and not to forget about that. And I'm going to also put up here, I'll move this out the way, put up here the contact details again. Todd Jones, as I mentioned, is our regional partner in Louisiana, and can be contacted via email or by phone. My email is there, and some of those URL addresses are there as well. So that's where I'm going to leave it. I think we have Stephanie back again. And what I'd like to do now is to open it up to questions. Again.
Thank you very much, Sean. We have a question from Rhonda Richardson. She asks, do you have any research or data on suicidal rates, plans, or attempts since COVID?
No, and what we rely on, so we're not a research organization, we're a education organization, and what we would then refer back to, where we would get this information would be from CDC and the YRBS. However, anecdotally, and this is anecdotal, one thing that we've been really aware of since the reopening is the mental health of educators and the mental health of school and district leaders needs to be looked at. Like, very often we dismiss, or those people in those roles and positions dismiss attention. It's becoming apparent that these groups and these roles also need support networks in order to reduce or ameliorate the mental stress that they're going through. For many of these people, and I would also put community health workers and leaders in there as well, for many of these people, they have been forced to make decisions about reopenings where there is no good answer. And so they're being forced to be put in positions where the decision they're having to make is which will do the least harm. And that's what we're finding out becoming a very, an additional stress on top of the other stresses that they're going through in dealing with this pandemic and dealing with their own family and personal health issues as well.
Thank you, Sean. As a follow-up to that, do you have any resources at your disposal that you could provide maybe some links to or information to for some of our attendees today?
Yeah, I would. What I can do is when I get back into the chat box, I can put some links in there. We do have, the simplest way would be if you go to ascd.org and then type in coronavirus into the search box. We have a whole page of articles and recommendations around coronavirus and how it's impacting schools. If you type in SEL and trauma, we have a whole series of articles and resources around those issues as well. We also have, this will be tomorrow, we are doing a ASCD virtual symposium on social emotional learning and trauma. This one, there is a fee for this, I believe. It's $49, but it's a half-day symposium and you get access to over 24 different sessions and keynotes around, from an educational perspective, around how schools are dealing with and trying to ameliorate the effects of trauma in their school settings. The last thing I'd mention, over the summer, we also put out a educational leadership magazine for free, based solely on remote learning, but also remote learning and how you build up belonging and connectedness. So for that one, you could, again, ascd.org, type in remote learning, and the page should come up. I can add into the chat box after this those links as well directly.
Thank you very much, Sean. That concludes our Q&A session for this. And Stephanie, from here, I'll turn it over to you.
And before you jump in, Stephanie, I saw a question about the copy of the slides, and I believe they are being sent out. If anybody doesn't receive a copy, then please feel free to email me as well, and I can send out a copy. But I believe they're being forwarded from the LA Healthy Schools. Thank you.